Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final event of the 24-25 Rothenberg Healthcare Law and Policy Speaker Series. If this is your first time joining us, I'm Diane Hoffman. I'm on the faculty here at the law school and direct the law and healthcare program. We have had an amazing lineup over the course of this academic year for this series with preeminent experts in the field of health law and policy focusing on different aspects of discrimination in health access. And we're thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Anya Marino, to wrap up this important series. Before I hand it over to her, though, I wanted to share a bit about this speaker series. As part of the Law and Healthcare program, the Rothenberg Speaker Series began during COVID, the COVID social distancing. Um, and we've continued as a virtual platform that brings together leading health law scholars and practitioners and connects them with our health law community. The series aims to explore and illuminate some of the most critical issues in health law and policy by bringing the work of preeminent experts to our audience. And thanks to the generous funding from the Karen Rothenberg and Jeffrey Seltzer uh, Law and Healthcare Program Endowment, we're concluding our fifth year of this wonderful series. Professor Rothenberg, as many of you know, was the former dean of the law school and founder and director for many years of the Law and Healthcare Program, which just celebrated its 40th anniversary last fall. As I said, the 2024-2025 series has focused on discrimination in healthcare. Other speakers have addressed discrimination based on race and disability, and today we're focusing on discrimination based on sex, a timely and important topic. Our speaker, Anya Marino, is an alumnus of our law school and the founding director of the LGBTQI plus Equality Clinic here at Maryland Carey Law. She's also the Chief Strategic Programs Officer at Advocates for Trans Equality. Prior to joining Advocates for Trans Equality, she served as the National Women's Law Center as Director of the LGBTQI Equality program there, and she led the center's legal and policy efforts to protect and advance the rights of LGBTQI plus people. Prior to that, she was an instructor at Harvard Law School's LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic and served as deputy legal director for the ACLU of Florida, where she oversaw the legal department's voting rights litigation and litigated LGBTQ plus and First Amendment cases. She was the first openly transgender woman of color to serve in any senior legal position throughout the ACLU's Federation of National and Affiliate Offices, and was the first transgender woman of color to teach at Harvard Law School. Throughout her career, her work has included representing the most marginalized and vulnerable members of the LGBTQ plus community, including transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. LGBTQ plus people of color, LGBTQ plus youth, and LGBTQ plus people in Southern communities. In 2022, the National Hispanic Medical Association honored her as a trailblazer advancing LGBTQ plus health equality, and Liaison International honored her as one of 7 women who shattered the glass ceiling in higher education. She earned her JD at Maryland Carey Law and is the law school's 2022 Rising Star Award recipient. Today, she joins us to discuss the historical and legal context of discrimination and sex-based classification in healthcare. Anya, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. It's always interesting to hear someone else talk about me, and I am someone who typically likes to just focus on the history around members of the trans and non-binary community, and also the history of discrimination and persecution that they have faced not only here in the United States but abroad. Again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. My name is Anya Marino. I use she, her pronouns. And as Diane Hoffman noted, I am the Chief Strategic Programs Officer at Advocates for Trans Equality. Advocates for Trans Equality is a social justice organization that is actually the merger of two previous organizations, the National Center for Trans Equality and the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. The National Center for Trans Equality was a policy outfit, whereas the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund was mostly a litigation and direct services organization. But here at A for TE, we strive to achieve trans, non-binary, and gender expansive liberation to ensure each member of our community maintains equal access and opportunity in all aspects of their lives. We embrace a multimodal approach to accomplish this objective, and we do that, of course, through the merged organizations where we advance and defend the rights of trans, non-binary, and gender expansive people through litigation and legal services, federal and state policy advocacy, strategic communications, public education and outreach, community organizing, and electoral engagement. Our work involves sharing our community members' stories in courts, administrative agencies, legislative bodies, institutes of learning, workplaces, prisons and jails, healthcare facilities, places of public accommodation, and public fora. So to really ground us in this conversation, I think it's important to first acknowledge that the trans community is not monolithic, right? We must look at the community through an intersectional lens. And intersectionality is a lens for acknowledging how each person may hold many identities and examining how those identities shape various forms of bias a person may experience. For example, a Latina transgender student is harassed and subject to different treatment because of their race and ethnicity, national origin, gender identity, and sex characteristics. When we discuss trans, non-binary, and gender expansive community members, we have to discuss intersectionality. We all live at the intersection of multiple identities, and our experiences are impacted by them all the time. We are always out in the world as our full selves, not just a part of who we are. And when we're talking about intersectionality and discrimination, we must be able to address issues that affect people because of who they are as a whole, not just because of one part of their identity. This also requires us to confront what undergirds transphobia and transmisia. Transphobia, of course, being the fear of trans people, transmisia, of course, being the hate of trans people. And undergirding transphobia and transmisia is racism and misogyny. Therefore, trans, non-binary, and gender expansive advocacy is informed by racial and gender justice advocacy. People who do not conform to white-centric gender stereotypes of femininity and masculinity are more likely to encounter barriers in education, employment, housing, income stability, healthcare, and other areas of life. After having grounded us in this, I think it's important to define a few terms for those who may be unfamiliar with some of the language that we use in LGBTQI+ advocacy. Now, there are many terms that I have listed here. I'm going to only highlight a few of them. The first of which, of course, is sexual orientation, which is a noun and is an individual's emotional, physical, and romantic attraction to another person. And then listed beneath sexual orientation is just a few examples of the different sexual orientations that people maintain. People may identify as gay, people may identify as lesbian, as bisexual, pansexual, asexual, or heterosexual. When we consider some of the language that's used for those who are gender expansive, again, I want to identify a few terms here. The first being gender identity, which is a noun and is an individual's innermost concept as male, female, or a blend of both or neither. Gender identity is how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. It can be different from the individual's sex assigned at birth. Now, each of us has a gender identity. Some of us have a gender identity that is aligned with our sex assigned at birth. Others of us have a gender identity that is discordant with that sex assigned at birth. And that leads us to what the meaning of being transgender or gender expansive is. Transgender is an umbrella term for individuals whose gender identity or expression is different from sociocultural expectations based on the sex they were assigned at birth. And a non-binary person is an identity embraced by some people who do not identify exclusively as a man or woman within the binary construct. They may identify as both, or identify completely outside the binary categories of man and woman. Now, we've discussed what a transgender person and a non binary person is, but it's also important to understand who cisgender people are. And that is a term we use to refer to an individual whose gender identity and expression correspond to their sex assigned at birth. In essence, anyone who is not transgender. Relatedly, it's important to understand what it means to be intersex. That is an umbrella term used to refer to individuals who maintain differences in their sex traits and reproductive anatomy, people who are born with these differences or develop them at an early age. Notably, intersex people can either identify as cisgender or as transgender. But many transgender people have one thing in common. And that is, of course, that several transgender people and non binary people experience gender dysphoria. Now, that is a medical diagnosis for the feeling of incongruence between one's gender identity and one's sex assigned at birth and the resulting distress caused by that incongruence. Untreated, it can lead to disabling distress, depression, anxiety, impairment of function, substance abuse, self injurious behavior, including self surgery, and even suicide. Having identified some of the terms we use when engaging in this advocacy, I want to begin by kind of centering us in what looks like a more authentic gender model. Now, if you see here, the gender and sexuality spectrum that is listed here acknowledges that gender identity, sexual orientation, and sex exist beyond the traditional binary of male and female, encompassing a wide range of identities, including trans, non binary, gender fluid, as well as genderqueer identities and various sexual orientations. So, for example, someone may be assigned female at birth, maintain a gender expression that is relatively androgynous, identify as a man as their gender identity, and have a sexual orientation where they are also attracted to men, so therefore they would be gay. So that just gives you an idea of how gender and sexuality as a spectrum is crucial for creating a more inclusive and accepting society where individuals are free to express their true identities. Most of us are more familiar with the rigid binary gender model, right? And this model assumes only two genders exist, male and female, and that gender is a rigid, fixed, and mutually exclusive category. Women and trans, non binary, and gender expansive people have suffered discrimination through our country's history, often to enforce a rigid gender binary and its associated stereotypes, which are both rooted in racism and sexism. These stereotypes paint anyone who is not assigned male at birth and anyone who rejects stereotypes and generalizations about the male sex as inferior to men and devalues them if they do not meet white centric standards of femininity that require them to be weak, submissive, and focused on domestic life and child care. Now, gender stereotypes undergird pretextual justifications for excluding women and all LGBTQI plus people from all components of public life. Examples of how this rigid binary has excluded all women and girls from public and private spaces are numerous. Throughout Western civilization, businesses, employers, schools, and governments have discriminated against all women and girls, sometimes enforcing romantic paternalism, which in practical effect puts women in cages. Throughout public life, women have endured wholesale exclusion, often sanctioned by courts and lawmakers. For example, the United States Supreme Court infamously held women lacked voting rights under the federal Constitution in 1874, reinforcing the notion that women were legally inferior in the court's decision in Minor versus Happersett. The minor court relied on state constitutions, which reserved voting to men alone, concluding the Constitution could not afford women suffrage as a privilege of citizenship. Therefore, women's exclusion from the ballot box endured for generations. Women were similarly denied access to other facets of public life. Men controlled economic and political realms and enjoyed a highly visible and extensive network of leisure institutions to which women had marginal or problematic access, including pool rooms, gyms, barbershops, lodges, and saloons, relegating many women to the domestic realm. An exclusion endured even after women secured many de jure civil rights protections. For example, laws limiting women's access to bars and nightlife remained in effect in the mid 1970s in Bayonne, New Jersey's ordinance prohibiting sales of alcohol and food to women at a bar. And only in 1975 did the First Circuit invalidate Rhode Island's law prohibiting businesses from serving alcohol to women in Women's Liberation Union of Rhode Island versus Israel. Women's systematic denial of legal rights and exclusion from public and private spaces relies on harmful stereotypes, again, including that women are weak or natural caregivers, needing protection from the evils of public life. These stereotypes come from generalizations painting womanhood as monolithic, punishing any woman that challenges these gender stereotypes. If women were excluded, persecuted, and punished for defying stereotypes, associated with this rigid gender binary, it seems almost axiomatic trans, non-binary, and gender expansive people would also suffer exclusion, persecution, and discrimination in all facets of public life. So we're going to take a moment to discuss the origins of TGNBI plus persecution and discrimination. You're going to see the term TGNBI plus used a few times here. It's somewhat similar to LGBTQI plus, but we're specifically talking about transgender, non-binary, and intersex people. To understand how this rigid binary operates against trans and non-binary and gender expansive people and against intersex people in healthcare, we also need to examine the history of trans, non-binary, and gender expansive persecution and discrimination more broadly. So the persecuting explorers that came over to the New World maintained extremely rigid notions of how gender and sexuality should operate and be organized. This perception of gender and sexuality can be found in rigid civil and religious statutes enacted by sovereigns and the church. Globally, Europeans efforted to eliminate non-European customs, traditions, and behaviors explorers frequently did through violence, capturing and enslaving non-Christian civilizations and forcing their people to convert under threat of additional violence was the accepted and routine practice. The legal and religious oppression and violence against non-Europeans provided a template for how colonists in the United States would treat Black, Brown, and Native peoples and LGBTQI plus people. It's in part because Europeans saw the behaviors of Indigenous people significantly different from their own. For example, many Native tribes had female presenting deities and structured their societies around matrilineal practices. Many Native cultures provided women and girls gender equality. Europeans found this respect and acceptance of gender expansive people particularly startling. For example, settlers often refer to natives who lived outside the confines of binary gender expression and those who were involved in same-sex intimacy as sodomites. Europeans rejected the idea that gender expansive people could be placed in socially elevated positions as religious figures, shamans, or artisans. And European 6th century religious and social practices treated people who did not conform to the church's concepts of sexual behavior, gender expression, and modesty as primitive and subhuman. They believed that non-Christian practices were primitive and meant those who did not conform to their concepts of sexual behavior and gender expression could be deprived of their life, their liberty, and their property. This can also be seen through Puritanism, which of course happened during the colonial era, but still has many roots in practices that we maintain today. So Puritans not only rejected the Anglican Church, but they also rejected the political and social excesses of other dissenting groups. They believed the Church of England maintained customs and practices akin to the Catholic Church, which Puritans viewed as excessive and immoral. Like European explorers, Puritans and other colonists seized native lands for economic gain. Establishing this new colonial society involved the creation of minority groups whose only purpose was to be vilified and persecuted for the illusion of societal safety. The idea of purifying religious and secular thought and practices was at the heart of Puritan culture. It's here that we begin seeing the enactment of sodomy laws. Puritans saw gender and sexuality as the prime axis by which society distinguishes between purity and danger. Nevertheless, we have documented examples of gender expansive people who lived in the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. For example, Jemima Wilkinson renamed themselves Public Universal Friend and refused to use gendered pronouns. They wore gender neutral clerical garments and believed Christ had entered their body while they were sick to become Christ's messenger. Public Universal Friend preached complete sexual abstinence and strict adherence to the Ten Commandments. Around that time, there was also a very popular publication known as the Female Marine, based on the real life of Deborah Sampson Gannett, who cross-dressed, took on the name Robert Shirtliff, and fought in the Revolutionary War until wounded in combat. Sampson Garnett married following their active duty, but published a series of semi-fictional narratives that detailed their romantic and affectionate interactions with women during this time. As a soldier, Sampson Gannett refused to be cast firmly in specific gender roles and appeared to represent themselves as either bigender or agender. Finally, another example that could be seen during the Civil War is Albert Cashier, who enlisted in the Union Army and fought in over 40 battles. Others did not discover Cashier was assigned female at birth until 1913, when he suffered from advanced dementia resulting in his admission to an Illinois Waterville State Hospital for the Insane. Following this discovery, Cashier unfortunately was forced to wear a dress until his death in 1915. Also important to this discussion is the horrible history of slavery that we have here in the United States and across the globe. Slavery was integral to how colonists and this country conceptualized individual freedom, race, property, and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. European colonists frequently justified the enslavement of African and Native American people based on their religious convictions. So to understand the persecution and discrimination of TGNBI plus people in the United States, one must also consider the harmful and perpetual impact slavery has had on our country. Organized, profit-driven slavery influenced all aspects of American life. Slavery constructed a legal system that mandated non-citizenship for non-white, non-Christian people. Even after its abolition, slavery evolved into inferior citizenship for Black and Brown people. But the denial of citizenship or maintaining inferior citizenship did not release Black and Brown people from the law, which is to this day enforced more harshly against Black and Brown people. Widespread slavery also reinforced and normalized European ideas about moral and sexual inferiority. Colonists, for example, believed Native Americans and Black and Brown people were incapable of moral Christian behavior. Accusations of sexual immorality took several forms. Non-white people were characterized as dangerously hypersexual. A primary reason why colonists and slavers depicted enslaved women as hypersexual was to justify the ability to rape and mistreat these women. The notion of hypersexuality also was used to justify violence against non-white men who were portrayed as being capable of sexual violence. Considering some of these themes that undergird the way in which trans and non-binary people and other historically oppressed communities have been treated here in the United States, we can now turn to the history of women's and TGNBI people's healthcare. Understanding the accessibility and mistreatment of TGNVI people in healthcare, again requires us to consider the history of misogynistic and racist practices existed in Western medicine that rarely meant medical justice for women and for people of color. For example, Western culture's rigid gender binary meant women suffered abusive medical care. The now abandoned diagnosis of female hysteria is responsible for much of the stigma and obstacles women were required and are still required to overcome to receive competent medical care. Understanding the negative impact being diagnosed with female hysteria meant for women requires knowing what the condition entailed. So let's talk about it. Hysteria was classified by many different symptoms and behaviors, but it essentially amounted to anything a woman did that wasn't viewed as acceptable behavior for an individual assigned female at birth. Common symptoms of the diagnosis included a swollen abdomen, chest pain, excessive emotion, increased or decreased sex drive, increased appetite, increased heart rate or pulse, interest in unnaturally male academic areas and hobbies or conduct, lacking interest in or disdain for marriage, fear of one's husband, and same-sex relations. Essentially, the healthcare system permitted society to subject women to involuntary hospitalization if they did not fit society's expectations of their sex assigned at birth. Moreover, having an all-male healthcare team of clinicians, pharmacists, diagnosticians only inflamed what men saw as abnormal. Treatments for female hysteria were horrifying, and they included forced ingestion of mercury, which caused organ failure, muscle weakness, and anxiety, opioids and hallucinogenic pharmaceuticals, pelvic massage and forcing women to orgasm, leeching and bloodletting, marriage, and forced hysterectomy. Undergirding the entire diagnosis, the healthcare community's belief that the uterus controlled a woman's physical and psychological health. During the diagnosis's use, women, intersex people assigned female at birth, and Black and brown women portrayed as hysteric, dramatic, or abrasive when they were simply trying to advocate for their own well-being. The diagnosis actually can be traced back to Egyptian papyri from about 1900 BCE, and explanations of the condition caused, including spontaneous uterus movement. Additional use of the diagnosis can be seen in Hellenic culture, which includes myths surrounding women of Argos who refused the sexual advances of men. Allegedly, the physician Melampus healed these women of their madness by giving them hellebore, urging them to have sex with young and stronger men. Hippocrates also first used the specific term hysteria to describe the alleged madness in the 5th century BCE. According to Hippocrates, the uterus was prone to sickness if deprived from sex and procreation, which allegedly promoted the cleansing of women's bodies, which were otherwise prone to putrefaction and the humors. References to female hysteria can also be present in colonial Salem, and were among the accusations brought against women all under the age of 20 who were charged and executed with witchcraft. And throughout Western civilization's development of medicine and healthcare, the alleged impurity of female bodies and its susceptibility to madness has meant women's bodies suffered hypersexualization, objectification, and exploitation. Underlying these horrible narratives and practices was Western culture's belief that a woman's own body, particularly her reproductive anatomy, predicated her medical conditions. We also see how this plays out most specifically for women of color. An example of this, of course, would be the practices of Dr. James Marion Sims, who is said to have tortured at least 12 enslaved Black women and girls for years between 1845 and 1945. Initially, Sims had little interest in treating female patients, which was uncommon among 19th century doctors, many of whom regarded gynecological work as unpleasant or inappropriate. Sims' autobiography detailed there was never a time that he could not, on any day, have a subject for operation. His notes describe subjecting a woman named Anarcha to at least 30 painful operations. When he described a woman named Lucy's recovery after one of these surgical experiments, he noted Lucy's agony was extreme. She is much prostrated, and I thought she was going to die after she had recovered entirely from the effects of the unfortunate experiment. I put her on the table to examine her. Now, after perfecting his surgical techniques on Black women without anesthesia, Sims went on to offer surgery for fistulas to white women while under anesthesia and sedation. It's unclear whether anesthesia and sedation were otherwise available to Sims when he preliminarily tortured these women. But what we do know is that these women were unable to refuse treatment or withhold consent. Anarcha, Lucy, and Sims, and Sims' other enslaved patients were powerless to protect themselves from medical exploitation. During and after enslavement, physicians often denied Black people basic dignity and personhood through mistreatment that reflected the prevailing dehumanizing myth that Black people were less sensitive to pain than white people. Controversy surrounding Sims' medical practice demonstrates how women's bodies, particularly the bodies of women of color, suffered objectification, exploitation, and violence. I want to shift gears for a moment to discuss some of the medical advancement that we saw developing in Europe around the turn of the 20th century, including, of course, the story of German-Israeli author, social worker, and suffragist Karl M. Baer, who became the first transgender person to undergo gender-affirming surgery in 1906. He was 19 when he came out as trans masculine and approximately 21 years of age at the time he received treatment. Now, Karl was both transgender and intersex. He was assigned female at birth, although his family raised him as a girl. Karl hormonally and genetically maintained masculine traits. Karl was a fierce feminist and suffragist supporter who also identified as man for years before accessing gender-affirming medical treatment. Karl's assigned gender was a complicated case from the beginning, with nurses describing him as abnormal. Although he was assigned female at birth, it is speculated that he would have likely been assigned male by contemporary standards. This is less a sign that gender assignment has improved over time. It hasn't. And more a display of how the medical community understands sex and gender have evolved with medicine. Like many intersex children, unfortunately, Karl's intersex status and his medical history were concealed from him. Consequently, Karl grew up with significant anxiety and distress over his assigned gender. And as he reached adulthood, he confided in a doctor regarding the distress he suffered over his assigned gender. The physician referred Karl to Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who recommended that Karl undergo surgical treatment to align his body and his gender identity. But we do see surgical treatment for trans people as early as 1906, which is completely contrary to assertions that we see today that gender affirming care is somehow experimental. Here in the United States, we also see the use of surgical care early on at the beginning of the 20th century. So, for example, Dr. Alan Hart sought gender affirming medical treatment in 1910. He is the earliest known gender affirming patient performed here to have gender affirming surgery here in the United States. After accessing gender affirming medical care, Allen was hired as an intern at San Francisco Hospital in 1917. But in February 1918, the San Francisco Examiner released a headline entitled, Girl poses as male doctor in hospital. Portland, Oregon's Daily Journal and the Austin American published similar stories that revealed Allen's trans status against his will. It turned out a former Stanford classmate recognized Hart while he applied for a laboratory position at Lane Hospital. Hart's former classmate mentioned his past to someone at San Francisco Hospital, and this information was subsequently shared with the hospital superintendent and news media. Unfortunately, Hart faced invasive and humiliating coverage, and he abruptly resigned from his internship at the hospital, returning to his home in Oregon. Hart struggled to outrun gossip concerning his status as a trans man, which negatively impacted his medical practice and meant moving from city to city to continue his occupation. He ultimately moved to Connecticut, where he earned a master's in public health from Yale in 1948 at the age of 57. He used his study of radiology and public health to advance the diagnostics and treatment of tuberculosis. Hart's life demonstrates the development of gender affirming healthcare here in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, and the persecution and challenges he suffered while asserting himself as the man he was. Around this time, we also see a development of the Institute for Sexual Science in Germany. In 1919, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld opened the institute in Berlin, and the institute housed a robust library regarding gender and sexuality for educational and medical purposes. The institute's clinical staff advanced a multidisciplinary medical practice, which included psychiatrists, gynecologists, dermatologists, and endocrinologists to treat what we now know as gender dysphoria. Hirschfeld specialized his practice in sexual health, which was an area of growing interest at the turn of the 20th century. Hirschfeld was among the first clinicians to argue that homosexuality and transgender identity and gender expansive identities were merely a component of natural human variation. He proposed the term sexual intermediaries for gender nonconforming individuals, recognizing that sexual orientation and gender identity were distinct characteristics, but inextricably connected to sex. And he also acknowledged the existence of gender fluid people. From 1918 until 1933, Germany's Weimar Republic provided a liberal atmosphere for Dr. Hirschfeld to develop the first multidisciplinary clinic. By 1930, the Institute would perform the first modern gender affirming surgeries and additionally offered its patients cross-sex hormone therapy. Its accompanying library included rare books and diagrams for
Oh,
trans
okay.
feminine surgical treatment. Among the Institute's many patients was Lee Elby, whose story inspired the 2015 film The Danish Girl. Now, as the Weimar Republic collapsed with the rise of Nazism and Adolf Hitler began as chancellor in January of 1933, Hitler adopted policies that embraced a rigid Germany that denied people lives that he deemed unworthy of living, which led to the genocide of millions of Jewish, Roma, and LGBTQI plus people. Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science represents a rare example of nuanced Western understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity. In contrast, Hitler and the Nazi Party's destruction of the Institute and their white nationalist ideology arguably represents the most violent examples of racism, misogyny, homomisia, and transmisia. They represent among the most horrific policy implementations of a rigid gender binary, much like Hitler's white nationalist ideology mirrors continuing racist, misogynistic, and anti-trans policies that exist today. But we do see some examples of trans people being celebrated here in the United States following the Second World War. So, for example, in 1952, the New York Daily News ran a front page story entitled XGI Becomes a Blonde Beauty. Bronx Youth is a happy woman after medication and 6 operations. The story of Christine Jorgensen shocked most American media. Publicity following her gender affirmation became a model for trans people. She was a tireless lecturer about being a transgender person pleading for understanding for a public that all too often wanted to see her and other trans women as deviants. And that's in part because city life, which enabled LGBTQI plus communities to develop amid mainstream oppressive ideas about social purity, in order generated a series of policies criminalizing LGBTQI plus identities, or what they called oppressor, or what their oppressors called homosexual behavior. Overt persecution of LGBTQI plus communities became more prevalent here in the United States through horrific campaigns to characterize LGBTQI plus people as sexual psychopaths who would harm and murder children. Although the media initially embraced Christine, it began to scrutinize her more harshly. It's around this time that we also began to see the rise and fall of gender affirmation clinics here in the United States. The opening of the clinic at Hopkins marked a transition within medicine from quiet deliberation to public recruitment for research in the practice of gender affirming treatments for transgender patients. Many major universities and hospitals developed clinical programs that embraced an interdisciplinary model between psychiatrists, urologists, plastic surgeons, gynecologists, and social workers. But towards the end of the 1970s, many clinics closed their doors to new patients. When Johns Hopkins Hospital hired Dr. Paul McHugh in 1975, McHugh pledged to end the medical practice at Hopkins. McHugh generally disapproved of offering gender affirming care to transgender patients and worked to rapidly close the clinic by 1979. Other clinics around the country suffered closure due to financial strain, as most insurance companies denied transgender patients coverage for any claim related to gender affirming health care. We also see the vilification of trans people and categorical inaccessibility of healthcare around this time. As members of the community became more visible, the social, political, and cultural changes regarding people's perceptions of sexuality and gender spurred an additional wave of conservatives arguing for sexual purity, the return to gender roles, rigid gender roles, and the importance of the nuclear family and marriage. Examples of this, of course, include Anita Bryant, who created a national campaign to vilify LGBTQI plus community members under the guise of saving children, and Professor Janice Raymond, who also denounced trans people in her 1979 book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male. Her writings argue gender-affirming healthcare, reinforced traditional gender roles, and merely colonized feminist identification, culture, politics, and sexuality. She claimed all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves. Now, Raymond was later contracted to author 2 reports for the National Center for Healthcare Technology and the Office of Healthcare Technology Assessment regarding her position on gender affirming care for trans, non-binary, and gender expansive individuals in 1980. These are the 2 agencies that predate what we now know as the Department of Health and Human Services. The National Center for Healthcare Technology specifically sought out Raymond to target the trans community and the efficacy of gender affirming care. Indeed, Raymond's work represented the whole of federal agencies' consideration regarding the ethical and social aspects of gender affirming care. Raymond's reports were intended for a specific audience of physicians, policymakers, legislators, federal health programs, and third-party payers of health insurance. Based on Raymond's reports, the Office of Health Technology and Assessment determined that gender-affirming care was controversial and must be considered experimental. But before 1981, gender-affirming care programs could use public funding to support transgender health care. Yet following Raymond's report, the Office of Healthcare Technology Assessment reversed course and prohibited the use of public funds to support transgender health care. And by 1989, a national coverage determination to exclude transgender healthcare from public insurance was published in the Federal Register. Between 1989 and 2013, gender affirming healthcare was routinely excluded from both public and private health insurance plans. In 2013, however, The Department of Health and Human Services determined its 1981 rationale for excluding transgender healthcare from insurance coverage was no longer reasonable. Therefore, in 2014, private health insurance providers began rolling back these exclusions. Let's talk about what's happening today. And I think we've talked a lot about gender affirming healthcare and its accessibility and its history, but not necessarily about what it is. So let's define it. Gender affirming healthcare refers to a comprehensive and supportive approach to healthcare that respects and affirms an individual's gender identity, regardless of whether it aligns with their gender they were assigned at birth. It involves several modalities: medical affirmation, social and emotional affirmation, and legal affirmation. The practice of gender affirming care has existed for more than 100 years. It is safe, effective, and relies on peer-reviewed study consolidated, approved, and recommended by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Indeed, every major medical organization in the United States supports gender affirming healthcare's efficacy, including the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinology, the American College of Obstetrics, the Endocrine Society, and the Federation of Pediatric Organizations, as well as the World Health Organization. Yet, despite the overwhelming acceptance of gender affirming care within the medical community, our state, federal, and local governments' effort to undermine access to care. Indeed, this year, at least 164 bills seek to prohibit gender affirming care. Many of these bills expressly seek to outlaw care for minors and adults. Others would impact insurance coverage or access to services, thereby completely eliminating access to this essential health care. And beginning on January 20th, 2025, the Trump White House has issued multiple executive orders that direct federal administrative agencies to undermine or altogether eliminate access to gender affirming care for persons 19 years old or younger, for veterans and their dependents, and for federal civil service employees. All these statutes and federal policies are drafted by the same special interest groups that seek to criminalize and otherwise restrict access to abortion care. All embrace a rigid gender binary that reduces all individuals to their reproductive anatomy and function. Although some use language lacking any knowledge regarding a human's in utero development and suggesting certain reproductive functions are discernible at the time of conception. For example, President Trump's executive order regarding the rigid definition of sex provides that female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces a large reproductive cell. So congratulations, according to Trump's executive order, we are all female. It's notable that each policy introduced or adopted requires individuals to conform their bodies to their appearances and their presentations to arcane sex-based stereotypes, while prohibiting individuals from receiving care and treatment that defy arcane sex-based stereotypes about an individual's body, appearance, and presentation. Each policy introduced or adopted extends or denies an individual's access to gender-affirming care based on their sex assigned at birth. Therefore, if an individual seeks medical treatment that further aligns their body with their sex assigned at birth, the treatment is permissible under these laws. But if the individual seeks medical treatment that would make their body discordant with their sex assigned at birth, the treatment is prohibited under these policies. Each policy is facially and in application a sex-based classification. But there are still avenues for legal relief. So, for example, transgender employees have successfully acquired access to gender-affirming care under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in employment, because oftentimes, based on court decision and also the interpretation of the express text of Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination and other forms of discrimination, prohibits different treatment in the terms, conditions, and benefits of employment. Other individuals have successfully acquired access to gender-affirming healthcare under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, however, trans youth have struggled to acquire access to gender-affirming care under either 1557 of the Affordable Care Act and the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment. Presently, there is a split among circuits, which is why the United States Supreme Court heard argument on December 4th, 2024, in United States v. Discrimination, which involves a challenge to Kentucky's law prohibiting gender-affirming care for transgender adolescents. Now, the argument that, of course, Kentucky makes, and that essentially was asserted by a majority of the Sixth Circuit panel decision, was that this, in essence, doesn't amount to a sex-based classification because no one can receive this type of care. But in all actuality, that's not true. Individuals who are able to receive the care, in essence, are cisgender intersex individuals who are able to affirm their gender identity so long as it is in alignment with their sex assigned at birth, get these same treatments that are frequently used for intersex and cisgender people are being deprived, are being denied to transgender people who also require this life-saving care. The court will determine whether a law prohibiting this gender-affirming care from transgender adolescents is a sex-based classification, and we expect the court's decision by the end of this term. I want to thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to provide you a summary of the discrimination that exists against transgender and non-binary people, and the way it is, of course, linked to the ways in which we see misogyny and racism operate not only historically here in this country, but still today. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Anya, for that incredibly comprehensive presentation. The history is really fascinating. I mean, I think that many of us don't know some of that history. So thank you so much for that. And I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has questions. We still have about 7 minutes left. We're asking that you type your questions in the chat, if you would. I guess maybe I can get us started. I think I mentioned at the beginning that I might ask you this, but what are how do you see maybe the discriminating case playing out? What are the different ways in which the court might respond?
The court may respond any number of ways, right? I think it is very challenging for the court to deny the fact that accessing a benefit, whether that's healthcare or any other benefit based on a person's sex assigned at birth, doesn't amount to a sex-based classification, even assuming that we're not talking about people in groups and we're talking about individuals. That's in part because the express language of the 14th Amendment recognizes that no person will be subject to an equal protection of law, right? It doesn't talk about groups. But beyond that, I imagine that the court may, and I'm not one to make predictions, but if the court were to decide that it wants to make a relatively narrow, unfavorable outcome, it may determine that the law in Kentucky amounts to a sex-based classification, but maintains an exceedingly persuasive justification such that it satisfies heightened scrutiny. It may argue that it is inappropriate for a child to undergo this type of care, which is, of course, the argument that we see many anti-trans extremists advance all the time, arguing, of course, that this care is experimental when indeed we know it's not. Somehow it's novel when indeed we also know that it's not. So I think it really depends on how closely the court also traces the record, and whether it really demonstrates, of course, that an exceedingly persuasive justification exists. And I would argue that one doesn't, of course, right? And that's in part because even assuming that, there have been changes to the standard of care from 5 years ago, medicine evolves all the time. The medical practice isn't stagnant, right? What we did at the beginning of the 20th century is certainly not the type of medical practice that we maintain today. Indeed, women can serve as physicians today, which was not something that they could ordinarily do at the turn of the 20th century even. So we also saw the rise of anesthesia being used more prevalently. And we've seen, innovation and other types of treatment as well. So to say that it's somehow experimental because it evolves over time just completely disregards how medicine works.
Right.
Um, I mean, I think if we're thinking about something the court may also do, and this is something that my colleagues at the ACLU asked for, and of course, what Solicitor General Prologar also asked for was for the court to just simply acknowledge this is a sex-based classification, and then to return it to the Sixth Circuit to determine whether exceedingly persuasive justification exists in the first instance, because the court did not do that. But I don't know. I think many of us are awaiting on pins and needles to see what the court will do, and how broad the court's decision is or how narrow it is will influence the way in which we litigate other cases on behalf of the trans community.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions for Anya? I guess not. So I want to thank you again for an excellent presentation, and thank all of you for your attention and presence. And I see that, oh, wait, we have a question that looks like maybe, Karen, do you have a question?
Yes, I put it in the chat, but it was only to Gian. This is a very, I hope it's a simple question. What are the implications of Trump's executive order that there are only two sexes, male and female? How does that play out? What does it mean, if anything, except, just a statement of Trump?
So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, of course, an executive order is not, a royal decree, and that Trump cannot himself make law. So the issuance of an executive order is merely a directive that the White House has issued to administrative agencies within the executive branch about the implementation and enforcement of the White House's policies. Now, that doesn't mean that it isn't going to have real world impacts, right? And it certainly will. We've seen the ways in which private actors in some state and local governments have already begun engaging in pre-compliance. As an example, of course, we've seen certain insurers over time simply say, we're going to deny access to hormone therapy for persons of any age at this point. We've also seen hospital clinics preliminarily close and then reopen. As an example, we saw that happen in California. So it has a real world impact, of course, on community members across the country. And of course, it intends to incite panic and fear, which it's certainly accomplished in many ways. But I think it's important for people to recognize, again, that these executive orders are not the law, and that many of my colleagues at A4TE and at many other social justice organizations are challenging the executive order that redefines sex narrowly, and the other executive orders that expressly target members of the trans and non-binary community. But beyond that, I think it's also important to recognize its real world implications for cisgender women, particularly cisgender women of color. And we've seen the ways that anti-trans rhetoric has actually increased violence against all women and girls. So, for example, Michelle Dion Peacock, who was a 50-plus-year-old Black woman who was living in Richmond, Indiana, was brutally slaughtered by one of her neighbors because he believed that she was a Black trans woman. Another example of this would be Jasmine Adams, who was dragged out of a Staten Island deli by her hair because the deli worker believed that she was a Black trans woman. And we've seen this also impact student athletes. So two examples of that, of course, would be in Utah, where two cisgender girls who were participating in athletics had their genders questioned by a member of the state school board. And because of that gender questioning happening across social media, it necessitated those two girls and their families gaining the protection of law enforcement to ensure their safety. So these do really have real world impact. And then beyond that, it also can potentially impact the way in which we interpret non-discrimination law more broadly. So for example, although we have the court's decision in Bostock versus Clayton County, in which the court recognizes that sex, of course, implicitly also means sexual orientation and gender identity. And we've seen Bostock's central rule extrapolated and used in other contexts. For example, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. We've also
Yes,
seen
I can answer that.
We've also seen it in Title IX of the Education Amendments Act, and we've also seen it in under the protection analysis as well. Many argue, certainly who are anti-trans extremists, that Bostock is a very narrow holding and should be limited specifically to the hiring and firing of trans and non-binary people or LGBTQI plus people, and doesn't even amount to addressing all of the other terms and conditions of employment, which I don't know how they come up with that, because it defies what the statute's text is. But you know, I think that's one implication, is the way that we're seeing the administration effort to weaponize non-discrimination statutes against trans and non-binary people in a way to exclude them from sex-separated spaces and other components of public life. And we will likely see the way that it's weaponized also against women of color.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, again, with that, really, thank you for that answer. So again, we want to thank you for your incredible presentation, and you know, we will be thinking of you as you try to confront many of these issues. I know it's a challenging time for you, and we appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you again for everyone else. This is the last in our series of this academic year, but we hope you'll join us next year for our continuing series of the Rothenberg Healthcare Law and Policy Speaker Series. So take care, everyone.